lifecycle services is that's where you provision your different, just like Jide just talked about, right? So the question he asked is what we call the finance and operations architecture. So this is what we saw was financial and operations. This is like the environment within the life cycle services. So when you want to provision the environment for users to use in finance and operations, there are three different layers. So when you pick that application, finance and operation, and once the provisioning is done in lifecycle services, it provides these three different layers. So if you pick finance and operation, there are three layers. One is the client layer. The second is the application tier, or what we call layout tier. Then the third is the database tier. So Microsoft Dynamics D365 has these three layers. So once that app that you see has three layers inside, whether you know or not, whether you're a user or not, there are three layers that are in D365 Finance and Operations application. And the essence of this architecture is to allow data, is for me, is just to allow support with the movement of data from one level of layer to another. For example, once I click save in a transaction, what happens behind the scene? Once you create something, you create a new customer, what happens? There are three layers that receive that information. And I think it's understanding the layer helps you better support users when they have errors. The only way you can go past just using the system to become a consultant so that when users have errors, you can support them with those errors. The only way you can do that is to understand the layers. So you need to know where is that error sitting. Is it sitting in the client layer? Is it sitting in the application layer? Or is it sitting in the database layer? So that's another level of so that's how. Now we're not going a little bit into the technical bit, but as a functional consultant, you should know where that error sits, at what layer within the system it sits. And when you know the layer, then you can approach it. You can know if it's at the database layer, you have to consult, the technical team, because you cannot, there's a level of limit you can have in the system. If it's at the application layer, you might have access to troubleshoot or to get access to the tables and the fields that affects that layer. If it's at the client layer, of course, that's a no-go area because that's where the the tenants are sitting. So let's look at them. Let me explain them. What is a client layer? Um, this is what users see and interact with. So by client layer, this guy, so every user, sorry, every user sits within a client in the system. We can also call it the presentation layer. So the database layer, the application layer, or what we call the client or presentation layer. So when you log into Dynamics, what you see is a client layer. That interface, that very beautiful interface. It is the screen you see at the browser. It is comprised of forms, dashboards, reports, data screens, just basic things that users can navigate through with. And of course in Dynamics, once you're a user, you're called a client. Like, you're a client, so you're a user. So that's it within the user layer. The second is the application layer. Again, it is the brain of the system. Now, when you raise a transaction and you click send or save or post, something happens in a milliseconds and you get a feedback. Either you get a feedback that it was successful, or you get a feedback that is an error, or you get a feedback that, there is a job that is running behind the scene. Whatever feedback you have, the layer that controls that feedback is the application layer. It is the brain behind. So it's sitting in the middle between the client and the database, and it sends information to both. That's why it's the brain behind the system. So again, anytime you log into the system and you do certain things and you get certain feedbacks, know that the thing that is controlling that stuff is your application layer. So it decides what should happen when you click something. So please mute your mic if you're not muted. So again, the application layer decides what should happen when you click something. So when you click, again, save, what happens, what decides what happens is the application layer. So for example, you have things like, when you do stuff like VAT calculation, when you post an invoice, when you set up an approval workflow, when you set up business rules or validations, or you want to run month-end reports, all that, what manages that piece of work and gives the client and the database information is the application layer. And it communicates with both of them in a split second. So what happens is when you post a transaction, it takes it to the database to validate, and of course takes it back to the client layer to give you feedback. You know, if there is an error, it means the database did not approve it. That's where you get an error. The last layer is the database layer, which is the data layer. That's where information sits. This is where all data is stored. So all your data is stored in the database layer. So see database layer like a storage room of the system. So Y1 is the storage room. This guy is the storage room. This one is the brain. And this is the user interface. So you see that the brain works with both of them, just like your brain, the human brain works with the body to be able to pass message. That's just the way it works, right? And so the database layer stores data, for example, customer data, vendor data, anything that will require you to pull out. For example, when you run reports, what are you doing? If you want to run financial statement or you want to run sales reports, what happens is once you click go or run or save, or once you generate an action, it will go to the database layer to search. These things happen in split seconds. It will go to the database layer, the storage, where all this data has been stored. And once you click send, it will go and retrieve. So first, once you click send, the brain, the application layer will now decide, what kind of feedback you expect. And then it will send a message to the database to say, the application layer sends a message to the database to say, please check in your warehouse or in your storage. Can you pull out this set of parameters for me? What happens is the database layer will send back the information to the application layer to say, yes, these informations are available and this is the output. The application layer will now send the message back to the client to say, okay, this is finally, this is the output of what you requested for. And you just see a report that has been displayed. But what has happened behind the scene beats human imagination, right? That is why when you have errors, one of the ways of being a very good consultant when you troubleshoot for issues is you need to understand where the error is sitting and the feedback. Once an application layer gives you a feedback, it also suggests to you where these errors might be happening or might be coming from. So you need to understand the tables and the fields within the database layer or within the storage that is creating that problem. And then, of course, most of them, you have to work with the technical team they have unhindered access to both layers. If you're a user, you only have access to the client layer. If you're a functional consultant, you have some access to the application layer, or maybe some, depending on your level of access. But of course, the technical guys have access to, hopefully all three layers. But they don't use they don't use the user interface for anything. So this is just giving you that clear understanding of the layers, and it's important that you note them down and you use them. So it's simple, right? Again, post an invoice. when you post an invoice, application layer will check the rules, check whether you have provided the date is correct, the customer details is correct. All those checks it does, it has to check. Then it goes to the database layer and gets you the transaction of what you need because that's where the storage is. And this is very, very important so that when you're having conversations with the technical teams and they ask you to do certain things, you can understand where those information are actually sitting. Please, if you have questions, let me know. I will pick them up as we move on. I think we'll go for a break very soon. All right. Again, let's look at the architecture, what it is. I think we have talked briefly about it. We have looked at, when you work with transactions. We have looked at, how, how these layers work together. We have looked at, so next we're going to